Hello and welcome to the Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. Each week, the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in finance take you beyond the numbers and hype, right to the heart of the big issues of the day. This week, we bring you the second of a special two-part exploration of the blue economy. We're discussing a white paper from UBS Global Wealth Management, which explores the ways in which the vital system of the global oceans can be supported, protected, and sustained for the long term. Now, back in June, we focused on the United Nations Ocean Conference, which took place in Nice, and we heard some reflections on a partnership forum run by the UBS Optimus Foundation at the Bank's Wolfsburg Centre for Education and Dialogue that was exploring similar themes and territory. Today, we'll hear from more innovators and thought leaders who are advancing the conversation in this space, and in particular, we'll interrogate the role that philanthropy can and will play in accelerating the transition to a sustainable ocean economy. Our panel today features Judson Berkey, Lead for Nature Activities in the UBS Group Chief Sustainability Office, Richard Miles, Senior Content Strategist, UBS Group Sustainability and Impact, and lead author of the Blue Streak Report, and a former guest on this programme, of course. And alongside them both, Chris Gorrell-Barnes, co-founder of the Blue Marine Foundation, a marine NGO that works with the UBS Optimus Foundation, and also co-founder of Ocean 14 Capital, an impact fund focused on investing in the blue economy. Judson and Richard, great to have you both back on the show. And Chris, a warm welcome for the first time. Now, Chris Gorrell-Barnes, before we get into the meat of the discussion, can you briefly tell me a little bit about how philanthropy and investing can and must both act in this space?
I think it's very important, that message that investing in the blue economy is not concessionary investing. Actually, we need to make this be marketed as something that is mainstream, and only then will we get the necessary capital for the transition that's needed to drive a sustainable and regenerative blue economy. That said, there's a lot of large philanthropists that want to put their money into investing in the blue economy. So it's a two-sided coin, but that's it. I'm all in on oceans.
That's great, Chris. And I think that taps into some really interesting areas that we might cover, which is about, not just, of course, the role of philanthropy, but blended finance, also just the sort of catalytic effect that innovation more broadly, whether we're looking investment terms or philanthropic terms or just in ideas terms, the catalytic impact that can have to address something which we know is very urgent. Let me come to you then next, Judson Berkey. Before we get into the weeds of this report, just maybe if you can sum up a little bit UBS's perspective here on the blue nature transition, just broadly. I think we kind of know the answer to this, but it's a compelling theme because it addresses something that is so urgent. And this challenge that we face also is rich with so many opportunities. But just give us the kind of house view, if you like, on the blue nature transition, first of all.
Yeah, sure. It's great to be back. Look, I think as with all the nature topics that our industry is trying to work on, we're in the process of learning and experimenting and trying to see where we can add value and support our clients. And as you mentioned, it's a macro theme, it's a macro challenge, and certainly starting to see some good progress from governments and other policymakers. Here's some steps forward. For example, at the recent UN Ocean Conference, it looks like we're probably headed towards a treaty of the high seas, taking effect once enough countries adopt. So certainly I'm seeing a lot of activity from governments, and our clients are getting interested. And so it's about really us trying to figure out where we can support them, either on philanthropic basis, on an investment basis, and contribute to some of the bigger transitions that need to happen to protect oceans, protect the marine economy, and find ways in which we can really direct capital into activities and work with others in a way that really helps move the needle.
Well, yeah, and speaking of moving the needle, Richard, obviously the report, which we'll get into, it puts some numbers here, right, which are really helpful because we see what in economic terms we could add to the global economy each year if we drive this blue nature transition, but also what it would take to get there. Just give us some of those numbers because they're quite helpful and instructive, aren't they, at capturing the scale of, again, both the challenge and the opportunity.
Yeah, well, if we start off with what the ocean economy is each year, at the moment, it's between $2 and $3 trillion US a year. And if we actually are able to achieve a blue nature transition, I mean, obviously all these numbers are sort of, models and stuff, but from the IPCC, which is kind of the gold standard on this stuff, if we can achieve a sustainable ocean economy, then by 2050, they think that would lead to higher global output by 400 billion a year by 2050 and 2 trillion a year by 2100, compared to the alternative as of business as usual. And these gains come from the result of lower declines in ocean health and services. We've also got other estimates by, for example, the High Level Panel for a Sustainable Ocean Economy, suggesting that if you just look at investments to sustainable fisheries management and mariculture, then you could see cumulative gains of 6.7 trillion by 2050. So the numbers are not insignificant on an economic basis.
Tell me, how did you structure the report and frame your thinking here?
We recently had a report out from the World Economic Forum, which was saying, there's 550 billion a year in opportunities in the sustainable ocean economy space. And yet the annual spend is a fraction of that, something like $26 billion a year at the last estimate. So there's a huge shortfall in the amount of funding. And the question, I guess, for us was, why is the sustainable ocean economy struggling to attract capital at scale? And I think the key reason for that is that this sustainable ocean economy remains quite immature in many areas. So like things like the conservation and regeneration of natural resources like mangroves and coral reefs. And there is a sort of a difficulty in attracting mainstream investment because of the lack of track record, the high perceived risk, the long payback periods. And these challenges are sort of compounded by things like fragmented data, the unclear ownership of some of these resources and the responsibility for them. So the upshot of that is that the pipeline of investable projects is not as big as it could be. And so the question for us was, what can you do to help? What can philanthropy do to help solve that? And so what we focused in this report on is the idea of philanthropy as kind of a bridge. It's not just about funding individual projects. That's not going to achieve scalable sort of systems change. It's about acting as a bridge between a sort of an unpriced ocean economy and an economy which is attractive to mainstream capital. That's when we get into topics like, monetization of blue natural resources, the possibility of blended finance as that sort of the bridge towards that more mainstream capital that funds like Chris's represent.
You mentioned Chrisen, and Chris, let me bring you in here, because what I find really interesting is I think our audience might be familiar with the work of Blue Marine Foundation and some of your work more broadly, highly intentional, quite progressive. But you seem to kind of go early with this idea that you also had to look at investment vehicles and investment innovation as well as, the kind of boots on the ground activity. Are you reassured to any extent that, I don't know, the discourse or the understanding of that more holistic approach here, is it catching up with where you kind of stuck the flag a few years ago? I mean, can you shine a slightly sort of optimistic lens on things for us?
I think we can nearly say we are in an ocean megatrend. I think that the awareness and the communications of the key role the ocean plays in food security, job security, mitigating the climate crisis, and just the size of the ocean in terms of biodiversity and blue natural capital is being understood by governments and investors. So I feel optimistic about that. And having just returned from the Blue Economy Forum in Monaco last week and the United Nations Ocean Conference in Nice last week, I feel optimistic, and I think we're making the right movements. From where I come from personally, it was clear that philanthropy on its own was not enough. I think the journey we started on 15 years ago with the Blue Marine Foundation was, okay, we need to have entrepreneurial, agile, innovative philanthropy here to try and tackle this problem. And Blue Marine has been incredibly successful over 15 years in attracting, some very significant donors and doing some extraordinary impact, and we've helped facilitate and protect 4.5 million kilometers of ocean. However, it became clear that, we are not going to solve this crisis unless we can have a sustainable and regenerative blue economy. And that requires a transition of an enormous $3 trillion economy that is not going anywhere. So the only way this is going to happen is with a transition. We need to transition shipping. We need to transition aquaculture. We need to transition fisheries. We need to transition tourism. And we need to have innovations in blue natural capital and unlocking what some estimate as a $23 trillion opportunity of blue natural capital, whether that's biodiversity or blue carbon or other ecosystem services valuation. So, optimistic. answer to your question, but we really need to unlock more money into the blue economy. So, Ocean 14 is a minnow at 201 million euros, but it's the largest private equity dedicated fund in the blue economy. And that kind of shows the opportunity, but the challenge, a $3 trillion economy. And we are, the largest fund there at 201 million. And I think that's not because it's, what you mentioned, Richard, an immature market. I think it's because it's full of a lot of SMEs, and the traditional investors are not knowledgeable of water-based industries. They're quite complicated. They're quite hard to have access to. Fish farming, aquaculture is quite challenging. Fisheries is quite challenging. But there's a lot of SMEs that aren't quite big enough for the mainstream investors to get involved in. So the opportunity as we see it is actually, how do we help these SMEs transition? How can we actually invest in these businesses and provide them, the financial capital and the operational support to be better businesses, both in terms of the financial returns and the impact returns that they can create? And, a big focus where we see is absolutely important for, humanity's survival is blue foods. It's really undervalued as a solution to the huge food security crisis and the huge challenges that big food systems are having in destroying biodiversity on land and the human health crisis. And blue foods is a big opportunity. So I think a real focus is needed on investing in blue foods. And then the last point I'll make about, the need for patient capital, if you like. I think putting philanthropic capital as something that's slightly more patient. Some of you might have read, a great article about what Lucas Walton's been doing with Builder's Vision, but there's it's kind of single visionary who's deploying 15 billion into this space, and really being able to unlock both sides is, okay, we'll put in some patient philanthropic capital, but we need that to be linked to private equity and venture capital so that you have got both areas to be able to invest in some of the challenging, less obvious return-based investments in the blue economy, but then link them to the ones that are more understood by more mainstream investors.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely fascinating. So many things I want to interrogate, Chris, from that. Richard, what other tools or levers that we have at our disposal here, and what does the report say about how best to operate them?
Yeah, and just to draw back a tiny bit, it's the fact that a lot of blue natural resources, they're unpriced, and that means they're unvalued. And that's what's sort of driving their depletion. It's a classic problem in sustainability. And so in this paper, we argued that if you're going to preserve and regenerate blue natural capital, you need to bring it into line with market incentives. And that requires demonstrating that there's a monetary value of oceans and resources like coral reefs and like mangroves, etc. And then follow on from that is matching that with financing opportunities that match risk rate of return, scale, time horizons of investors and capital providers' expectations. And this is where we think that there is a really unique and powerful role for philanthropy to play as a catalyst for the change that's required. So by funding and facilitating projects that break new ground in that area of pricing and monetizing blue natural resources, that's how they can kind of achieve a contribution to systemic change. And the problem is that a lot of these tools, they are still emerging. They are quite early stage in some cases, and that's of what makes them sort of slightly off-putting to traditional investors. And these are tools like tradable blue carbon credits, biodiversity credits, payments for ecosystem services where you pay people to sort of, preserve and regenerate, coral reefs. You've got the sustainable marine businesses like sustainable tourism, sustainable fisheries, that sort of thing.
I agree with you. I think the opportunity forgetting the $23 trillion, valuation of the ocean's blue natural capital, but just looking at blue carbon, right? If you think of 80% of the carbon that's sequestered in the planet is going into the ocean, right? So this is where the carbon is. How do we unlock that? And to your point of, philanthropic endeavors being able to unlock that, Blue Marine has partnered with Convex, very visionary founder in Stephen Catlin, who's done some incredible sort of data projects in his life, from the first Antarctica seascape survey to this Convex seascape survey, where I think it was a $15 million donation, and we are halfway through getting the data set of, how much carbon, where and when is the carbon sequestered in basically in the mud and the sea shelf and the sea floor of the ocean. So the scientific estimate is that 80% of the carbon that's sequestered in the ocean is in fact on the floor. It's not in the mangroves. It's not in the seagrass. It's in the mud. And no one's done that data set. So if you can do that and actually then create this sort of the platform saying, okay, we know where the carbon is, you can then use that to securitize and unlock huge amounts of conservation and really drive a blue carbon market. So I think your point being, we need kind of innovative philanthropic support to try and unlock some of this. But I think, we need the juggernauts of government money to come in to really unlock the opportunity to drive the conservation.
Back to you, Judson Berkey. With that need that Chris describes there and with the complexity we've discussed already, are we getting any closer? Is the tide, I guess, forgive the pun, turning in terms of what clients are asking you for or about? Are we, whether government or investors or the discourse, is it all moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I think it's an evolution. I mean, as we've seen on climate, right? I mean, governments can put in place useful signals, and the fact that governments start talking and trying to agree on things, whether it's marine protected area expansion or plastics treaties and these things, I mean, that sends signals that private individuals can see, obviously, and then it shows a seriousness and intent to try and focus on a topic. So to the extent that investors can be part of that and see a building theme, a building wave, so to speak, certainly it gives some direction to where they want to put their focus. But as you say, I mean, look, there'll be any number of individuals who, on a philanthropic basis, just want to be part of a solution and really want to experiment and want to do some of the innovative work that Chris just described. And the extent that that's happening, I mean, that's great. We'd love to support that. We'd love to learn from that, honestly, because that's as much education for us to it supports efforts, which then can flow through into the investment thinking as well. As things scale up, as you see where the real blue capital is and what is where the value really lies, then certainly that gives direction to what then can become more commercially orientated investment structures and activity. So it all does kind of tie together, but certainly seeing governments start to move and start to act focuses everyone and really can help accelerate a lot of the thinking and a lot of the investment structuring and ultimately the capital flowing.
Yeah, and just to return to the report, Richard, I don't know if you could perhaps pick out, because there's some really interesting and compelling examples in there. Is there maybe one you could just mention that sort of highlights maybe a little bit, a problem, it has the real world fix, and then it demonstrates some of those monetization tools that you spoke about a moment ago and how it's bringing all of these different stakeholders together. Maybe you could just give us one example that sort of is an elegant illustration of this best practice in action?
Yeah, no, very happy to. I mean, there's some really interesting examples and the innovation that's required in this space to kind of get the financing flowing and to kind of, put a price on these resources and make sure the funding's available for their protection is really exciting. One example I really like, and this isn't a UBS example, so I'm not plugging our own stuff here. It was an insurance policy for a coral reef off the coast of Mexico. And this is kind of one of these problems where there's often insufficient connection between the diverse stakeholders that you need in order to achieve meaningful change. So this is a few years back, and various foundations, including the Rockefeller Foundation, the Bank of America Foundation, launched what was essentially the first parametric insurance model to protect Mexico's Quintana Reef. And so they created a trust with funding, but was provided by local government levy taxes on local hotels who were going to sort of benefit from the reef. And then they bought an insurance policy from the Mexican insurer firm Seguros, and that was then reinsured by Swiss Re. And then the policy was actually triggered following Hurricane Delta and sort of released a payment for restoration work on the reef. And so, and this is something which wouldn't have been possible without sort of the philanthropic role of those foundations. They're essentially playing that stakeholder connection role, and that model now has actually been sort of successfully scaled and replicated in other areas. So it's a really interesting example of how philanthropy has this role, this stakeholder connecting role, as well as this funding role to enable things which just wouldn't have been possible with traditional capital alone.
Well, Chris, can I ask you for an example too? I mean, there's so many fascinating and amazing projects, whether that's, through the BMF lens or an Ocean 14 Capital project. Is there one that you like to sort of roll out that, I don't know, perfectly distills some of the values that you were talking about, but also some of that potential and maybe a little bit of that optimism that you mentioned at the top as well?
I think that Lucas Walton's organization, Builders Vision, I think that's the holy grail. They've invested in Ocean 14 Capital, and they have this incredible ecosystem where they have the philanthropic capital, the patient capital at scale. They often talk about, how do we go from NGO to IPO? How can we look and help organizations that might be doing incredible initiatives, but just unfundable for, traditional investors, but actually the potential with the knowledge and the science that a lot of these NGOs go to unlock something that with amount of time and patience can actually come to something which is a commercial endeavor. And I think when you do look at what is happening in the ocean and the science and the challenges of unlocking some of the commercial opportunities, that kind of ecosystem and patient capital where you can come in with some philanthropic capital to support, maybe transition something to be more commercial, and then also have the runway to bring in then the more commercial, sophisticated investors to help those businesses, organizations, initiatives, whatever you want to call them, thrive. So I would put a halo around Builders Vision and what they've created as an example to bringing all of this together in a very smart way to have the real scale of all the different types of capital you need in the stack to drive oceans.
And Judson, finally, driving the Blue Nature transition towards maturity. You mentioned earlier philanthropy's impact, not just project to project, but on a systems level. Can we drive the change on the accelerated timeline that we must follow? Are you still optimistic?
Look, I think one has to be optimistic or else one doesn't try, but one also has to be realistic about what it's going to take. And so I do think we need some of the great examples that Chris outlined to really take forward. In this report, I've tried to give sort of a range of examples, some of which are about working at more of a systems level, or at least at some points that Richard made about trying to prove an initial use case that then can be scaled. And so to give that example, you use philanthropy as that initial lever to show that something could be possible, to figure out how to make it more commercial. So to you basically have the freedom to make the mistakes along the way to learn, and then arrive at a model that can be rolled out and scaled. And they've talked a bit about some of the mangrove restoration examples and trying to wrap together projects across different geographies into something that's a bit more of a fundable model. Any number of examples that I think we've been trying to support over the years, where you have philanthropists really who are willing to either be that patient capital, or to be the that first loss capital, or to at least be the experimental capital to figure out, okay, how do we turn this into essentially something that generates a consistent set of returns, because that's what you need for a commercial investment, right? You need to have some set of returns you can actually put a value on, and then build that into your investment thesis. So I do think, there's a lot of energy, a lot of brain power, a significant amount of money going into this. So I think that's all gives me optimism, I guess, that we will be able to make progress here, and as people continue to understand the importance of the ocean economy and things like the David Attenborough work, clearly help tell that visual and emotional story, but also the scientific story as well. And so as people understanding increases, there's increased motivation, I think, to take action. And certainly we're very motivated ourselves to try and support that.
I agree with absolutely what you said, but how do we drive more velocity? Because we need to move at pace now, and I think that is clear. The ocean is, intensive care. It's in ICU, and we really need to move this needle very, very fast, and we need to unlock large amounts of institutional capital to drive that transition. So, reports like this, super useful, but there needs to be some more innovative, and you could say brave, or you could say intelligent investors, bringing large amounts of capital into this space, because, I think the ROI is so enormous that if we don't have, a healthy marine ecosystem, we are in deep, deep trouble. So, this is arguably the most important investment thesis of all time. So how do we really encourage these big institutional investors now to come in and put their capital into driving this transition?
Chris Gorrell-Barnes, Judson Berkey, Richard Miles, thank you all for being with us on this edition of The Bulletin with UBS. And you can find out more about how UBS can help you at ubs.com. While you're there, search Optimus Foundation for more, or look up Blue Economy there for more information, links and resources. Do check out the first part of our special exploration of the blue economy, which we published back in June. You can find that and all the other episodes at monocle.com or wherever you get your audio. This is The Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. I'm Tom Edwards. Thanks for listening.